So today we're going to talk about search engines and the whole idea of search as a process of bringing order to the web and of creating bias in the process. Basically, the argument is what shows up in my book, Search Engine Society. So you can either watch the video or buy my book. Wait, no, I take it back. You should just buy my book. So let's talk. We're going to talk about a few things. We're just going to kind of briefly do an overview of where the search engine came from, then talk a little bit about and what it does, and then talk a little bit about this whole question of search engine bias and how we can either avoid that or whether we should even be avoiding that. So let's start with where the search engine comes from. Search, of course, goes back millennia. As soon as libraries got big enough that you didn't know every book on the shelf or every manuscript on the shelf, you needed some system, some externalized index that allowed you to find what you needed, what you were looking for. So the idea of search goes back very far, and in fact, a lot of what search engines come from is this history of library search, of finding information in a large collection of documents. But for the web, that wasn't initially thought of as important. Certain earlier internet technologies, things like Gopher, things like anonymous FTP sites, for these it made a little more sense to have to search because the things were collections that were distributed. It made sense to have an index, but the whole idea of the World Wide Web was that it was a hyperlinked web. You were supposed to surf it. So why on earth would you kind of undermine that by creating an index and just having it be a pile when it's already networked? It already has a kind of map to it, right? And, it's this kind of weird... So there's two things that moves it into the need for search engines. The first is that there's just a whole bunch of stuff, right? At some point, the collection gets so large that you need to have an index to search it. But the second is not just a matter of kind of not being able to keep an eye on what everything there was out there. Nowadays, when you search for a term, it's going to be out there, right? There's going to be a website that covers your term because there's so much stuff on the web. But early on, if you had a search engine, that was kind of dumb because the chances that the thing you were looking for was on the web was very, very small. And it's no fun to have a search engine if 99 out of 100 searches come back with 0 answers. Don't have anything like that on the web. So part of it was this kind of trick of getting past the overabundance, and part of it was that finally search made more sense than browsing around to a certain extent. Early on, there was a kind of an intermediary step here, which was taxonomies. Things like Yahoo started out not as a search engine, but as a bunch of lists, kind of like bookmark lists, a collective bookmark list categorized into subjects. So you could say, I'm interested in arts and culture. At the very top level, there were a set of top level kinds of questions around technology or arts and culture or around education. And so you drill down to that, and then you drill down for education to universities, and then you drill down to US universities. You go through these steps until you had a collection of, 20 or 30 or 100 websites that fit into that. So, Yahoo as a private concern and DMOZ as a collaborative approach to the same thing. Both of these were attempts to bring order to the web that went beyond kind of surfing from site to site, from page to page. Pretty soon, though, the web was growing so exponentially that keeping up with it, especially by hand in this taxonomic process, was just not possible. And it's a little bit like having a book. If the book's long enough, you no longer can rely simply on the table of contents, which is kind of what Yahoo was. You really need an index, and so you had to start indexing the web. And there were a bunch of approaches to this. There was a whole period that I'm skipping over years and years here, where we went into something called the search engine wars, where everyone realized fairly quickly how important search engines were going to be to this new internet space and probably to the internet economy. And so everyone wanted to kind of grab that because it's why is this important? Because the one thing that is scarce in an information economy is attention. This is something that people realized going back into the late 1960s, that the thing that was going to be scarce was human attention, and therefore it was the most valuable thing you could have. And search engines represent kind of the focusing mechanism, the focusing technology for attention. So it made sense that they were of interest. How does a search engine work? We won't go into the deep details of this, but basically it sets up a robot that goes from page to page and pulls out all of the terms on that page and sticks them into a database, an index database. And then you have an interface on the other end where users can type in a word, and it somehow extracts the pages that include that word or otherwise are related to that word, and it arranges them in what it thinks the order of importance is. So a bunch of these, early on, the real question was, how do you choose a search engine? You choose the search engine that has the largest database, right? The one that could crawl a larger proportion of the web. Even today, search engines like Google only crawl a minority of the web, only a portion of the web. There's a lot of stuff out there that the search engines never actually manage to hit, either because they're behind paywalls or they're behind passwords. This is the so-called deep web. Or just because there's too much for it to handle that's not linked, and so it's not easily encountered by a bot unless someone actually says, hey, here I am, index me. And so a lot of stuff on the web just isn't indexed. But early on especially, you wanted the biggest index. You were, your best search engine, your best chance of finding anything was to hit a search engine that had a lot of stuff in it. But then 1994 happened, and in 1994 you could create you could distribute commercial information over the web, and you could advertise things. The first advertisement was a Arizona immigration attorney advertising his services over Usenet. But very quickly, a lot of people started getting online. The first industry to actually make money in a substantial way online for a very long time, for a period of years, was the pornography industry. People would pay for porn online. And so you really needed to get people to know the porn was there and to get them through the door. And because this was the big money maker, that people were willing to invest time and energy in getting people to look at their site. And in fact, the pornography sites often did this as an affiliate mechanism, where if you could, they basically pieced it out, and if you could convince people to go to their porn site, you got paid. So it was this first effort at kind of really distributing the marketing message and advertising message. And the obvious target for that, again, was where attention was focused, and that was on the search engine. So as quickly as these search engines got large and kind of distributed, they got descended upon by people who were trying to, spam dexters, people that were trying to change the index so that it sent people to their sites. And the first thing the search engines did was outlaw certain words, and if they would knock you off the page. But there was this cat and mouse where those who were trying to get porn results, even if you weren't searching for porn, and early on there were a lot of searches for porn. This receded over time, but especially initially, a large proportion of people were searching for porn on the search engines. The search engines weren't especially interested in generating results for that, but they were especially not interested in this. There were all kinds of stories like this, but one of my graduate students had a niece over at their house, and the niece was over looking for pictures of horses, and they ended up with a picture of a horse with a human doing something other than riding, or I guess something other than riding. And so they were alerted to this by a scream from the other room. This is something that a search engine doesn't want. So they tried to exclude several of them tried to exclude all pornographic sites from their engine, but they were losing that battle. The people were managing to manipulate the process of search so thoroughly that it was really hard for them to get at the real information. And through this came Google. And Google introduced a new algorithm for deciding what was important. Now, important is going to be a tricky word here, but figuring out what was important to your search terms. And the way it did that was not just what was on the page. It wasn't just the words that were on the page, but the kind of neighborhood that it was in. So if a bunch of people that Google trusted pointed to, through hyperlinks, pointed to your site, then it was much more likely that it was important. How do you know who the important people were in the neighborhood? By who pointed to them. So it was this very circular process by which you traced kind of the hyperlinks, and if enough of them concentrated on a site, that gave it a high page rank. So this algorithm was called PageRank. Larry Page was one of the people that was involved early on, but it was called PageRank, and it was built on this idea in the scholarly world of kind of measuring citations, citation analysis. And the idea in the scholarly world is if something gets cited a lot, it's probably pretty good. Regardless of what the content is, if you look at all the citations, maybe something that gets a lot of citations is likely to be of higher quality or more important in some way. And so they just pretty simply applied that to the web. It was a project. They were graduate students at Stanford, and it was the kind of their grad project, and obviously it got a lot bigger than that. And for a long time, Stanford actually co-owned the some of the patent stuff around the PageRank algorithm, and so they got paid by Google for a while. It wasn't Google at the time; it was called Backrub, but eventually it became renamed Google. Thank God, because I'm going to go Backrub something doesn't have the same ring to it as I'm going to go Google something. But Google basically ate the competition at this point, because this process, at least early on, spamdexers didn't think about how they could create spam for this. Eventually they did. They realized they had to create large numbers of separate sites, all of them linking to other numbers of separate sites that then finally linked to their site. But it became much more expensive and difficult to manipulate Google as a search engine. And as a result, largely as a result, Google ended up getting more and more of the search traffic, which led people to ask, is Google biased? And I think that the answer is yes, but I think that that's a feature, not a bug, right? That the whole idea of a search engine is to give you bias. Just like the whole idea of a newspaper is not to tell you everything that went on in the world, because then you would just go and look at everything in the world. That's not why you go to a newspaper. You want the newspaper to act as a filter. You want it to take out some things and include the things that it thinks is most important. And so by its nature, news is a biasing process. And likewise, by its nature, search is a biasing process. So the question isn't whether it's biased. You want it to be biased. The real question is it biased in a way that's useful to you? And the answer is Google wants it to be biased in a way that's useful to you, because then you will come to their site and use it, and they will make money from their customers. Their customers are not you. Their customers are advertisers. It's amazing how quickly search, and especially Google, kind of took over a large amount of, made a lot of money and became one of the most profitable businesses in the world. And it did that not by selling anything to you. I actually pay Google a little bit, but I suspect most of you don't pay Google anything. You're not their customer. Their customer is the people largely that put advertisements on their search engine and that advertise through them on other sites. That's where they make their money. And so in order for them to be able to do that, they need to have the largest and most diverse audience possible. And in order to have the largest and most diverse audience possible, they need to have the best search results they can. Now, one of the ways they do that is through PageRank. That's what's really gave them the big jump forward. But at this point, that's just one of nobody knows how many signals, because we don't know quite how Google works. We have a rough idea. We can guess at it. We can try to reverse engineer it. But generally speaking, we don't know exactly what Google looks at and how it weighs those things. These are usually called signals. So it weighs anywhere from 40 to 60 different signals probably. We don't know for sure. And then it kind of decides which of these are most important so that it can give you, based on those indicators, it can give you the page that they think is most important. And that means most useful to most customers. Early on, they said that's really what they were trying to do. Most useful to most customers. They, when I did the first edition of the book, at that point they were saying they don't have any interest in personalized search. Now they've backed off that a little, and they're doing a bit more in personalized search, giving you results in different cities, for example, that are unique to that city or different countries. This idea of kind of geofencing and providing some indication of something that is more local to you. And if you really want to get the best answers to people, you probably should personalize it. You should be interested in what kinds of things they've looked for in the past, and maybe even their search behaviors, and maybe even what they bought. The more signals, the better. So, but they have to walk this very delicate balance of how much data they're going to collect from the world at large about you, personalized data, private data, and how they're going to apply that to the search, and whether that's going to freak you out more than it helps you. And that's a difficult balance. So because it's biasing these for some general user, the question is not, is Google biased, but how is it biased, right? Is it biased in a way that helps you? So if I'm a white supremacist and I'm searching for Martin Luther King, I want the first hit to be a site that says that Martin Luther King was this horrible person. And for a while, that was the case, that a white supremacist group had put together a hit piece on Martin Luther King, and any kid who was doing his sixth grade report on Martin Luther King, on that first page of search engine results, which is the only page most people ever see, was this hit that said, that took them to this basically white supremacist view of who MLK was. And so that is great if you are a white supremacist, but is that the most important or best answer for most people? No. The algorithm failed in that case, I think, from a generalized perspective. So that's the question we should be asking. Are these search results good, which is the one, or important, which is the way that most search engine designers think, but rather, who is it good for? Who is it important for? There are always going to be winners and losers. You have a web that's filled with billions and billions of pages. It's still growing at an outrageous pace. You're never going to be able to give someone all of the pages. So you have to pick a very small number out of that huge number. Most people choose the first thing in the first top ranked thing in the search results. Some people will read the first page. Very few people will go to page 2. Almost no one will go to page 3 on search results. So it's kind of the nature of the beast. And we've seen these kinds of curves elsewhere too, that there are winners and there are losers, and there's this power law that describes how many people visit the most popular sites as opposed to the least popular sites. The vast majority of sites on the entire web will be visited by a handful of people or no people at all. And then there's a handful of sites that are visited by almost everybody, almost every day. So you've got this very strange distribution. We think of the web as being evenly distributed, this democratic space for information, but that's really not quite true. It's actually pretty focused on a few central sites. From this search engine that ended up dominating public search, right now Google is almost everything. I bet you can't guess who the second one is, and I will leave that to you to find out. Most of you probably haven't used it, but by and large, Google is the kind of 800-pound gorilla. It runs search, but gradually it started to run other things too. I use Gmail every day. The Arizona State University, the university uses Gmail as kind of one of its central email processors. A lot of people use Gmail. So Gmail was one of these. For a while, they had their own, actually had several of their own social networks, things that were supposed to rival Facebook, but never really took off for various reasons, mostly because they were bad. But things like Orkut, which kind of was an early effort that was very small scale, but very, very popular, especially in places like Brazil, really did rival Facebook in many ways, but it just never caught on the same way because, frankly, it wasn't as well developed over time. They got into scanning books. They got into figuring out who had the best flights. I mean, Google started to get their hands into just about everything. Google Docs, they moved into the space kind of that was occupied by Microsoft, and were starting to erode that. So their tentacles were reaching into all sorts of different things. I mean, this was part of their original mission, which was to organize the world's information. It wasn't just to make a good search engine. They really wanted to kind of organize all the information in the world, and that meant more than just a search engine. It meant kind of figuring out how best to organize things. An author named Siva Vaidyanathan has this book called The Googleization of Everything that really talks about how Google as a private enterprise was moving into more and more of this stuff over time and what that meant. Because it meant that a private company was controlling things that in the past might have been done by a library, for example. Because of this, Google has become this really centralized corporation that controls a lot of the traffic on the web, and that means a lot of the traffic in our heads. Yes, there's rivals. This came as a surprise to me, and it probably will to you as well. In terms of total number of searches, Facebook is actually gaining on Google. It has about 2/3 the number of searches. So people actually search for things on Facebook, something that I've only very rarely done. But a lot of people will go on Facebook and do a search there. So there are other places where people are doing searches, but by and large, it's Google. And this means that we have a very serious issue around the concentration of power. We also have a lot of people who've complained about this sort of end of serendipity. In the very early period of the web, you could go on the web and you just surf around and you end up with something that you never really expected to find yourself at. I think there are places you can still do that on the web. I think that's one of the reasons Reddit is popular, because very strange things pop up that you were not looking for. But Google often is accused of being one of the companies that has killed serendipity, right? Because it becomes very utilitarian. I'm searching for this, give me answers about this, I have my answers about this, I'm done. And that kind of gets rid of some of the ability. Even in a library, you can go in and browse the shelves. It's hard to avoid browsing the shelf. Yes, you may be searching for a very specific book at some point, but there's a good chance you're going to look around the shelves a bit as well. And that browsing and that serendipity is really kind of pounded out of the web when it becomes this basically unvariegated collection of documents that are then indexed. And that index process itself is not transparent. It's a black box. There is this ongoing kind of still cat and mouse between people who are search engine optimizers and search engine marketers and Google itself. And if you know the secret recipe of Google, you are instantly rich. Seriously. If you can figure out how Google organizes its search results and then promise any client that they're at the top of that search, that set of search results, you will be paid just about whatever you want to be paid. That information is incredibly valuable. And so because of that, Google doesn't want to tell you how they organize information, and the marketers really want to know how they organize information. But as a result, it's very black. You don't quite know why it is that you're getting the search results you're getting. You just have to kind of trust the Google, and that can be a little bit unnerving. What if you decide you don't want to? What are your alternatives? What's Google? Are you going to go to Bing? No, because Bing sucks. I mean, I'm sure that's not fair. Microsoft has done some interesting things with Bing, but by and large, at least in my personal usage, it comes up with much worse search results. So you're not going to go to Bing. You might go to something like DEG, DuckDuckGo, which is this. It came about as a way of not recording your searches, of giving you a little bit more privacy, so that you don't have the big Google watching you, and that's good. And it actually produces pretty good search results too. So that's one possibility. But the number of people going to DuckDuckGo is tiny. It's in the 1% range, right? It's just a very small number of people of mostly techies and people who are concerned about their privacy that have switched over to that. But it's not a Google killer by any means. I mean, the thing that would get away from some of this problem of centralization is peer-to-peer search. And there actually have been efforts, and there continue to be efforts around a peer-to-peer search engine where it kind of looks at where you're going, and instead of using crawlers, robots, to go and suck the information off the web, it gets it off your browser and then creates an index off that is, decentralized. You could actually do this. Let's apply blockchain to everything, but you could do this in a way that has kind of a distributed ledger, because a ledger is an index to a certain extent. So there are some ways we could do this that are more distributed. That gets rid of some of the private ownership issues and some other issues as well, but it also takes up more resources on the web. I mean, already Google takes up huge chunks of energy and web kind of traffic in order to gather this information. It's not clear that a peer-to-peer system would use less of this traffic, and indeed it probably would use more. The other part of this is search. The search engine is changing. I don't think we'll be talking about search engines in 5 years or 10 years, because the engine is disappearing. We think about the interface for Google, which is this very nice white screen. They've played with other stuff, but it's a very plain screen. It's a search box. Most websites have a search box on them as well. But that box is kind of it used to be essential. If you were going to do a website, even if it was a tiny website, you had to put a search box on it because that's how people were expecting to interact with it. But that is changing. It's changing for a bunch of reasons. One of the big ones is mobile. that the vast majority of searches now are on mobile devices. In fact, Google has decided to update a special, its index for mobile searches much more quickly than its traditional index for the desktop. So they have separate indices for these two, right? So each of those indexes is being updated, but one is being updated much more quickly, the mobile one. And those searches on mobile are often going to be slightly different. They're often going to be within a physical context, so that can be used as a constraint or a filter. And often they're part of an audio agent, right? That a conversational agent. People are doing voice searches much more frequently than anyone I think had expected. So some of that's something like Alexa, which is a conversational agent, but a lot of that is Siri. Or the outgrowths of that. That is people on their machine doing a search using their voice. Some of it doesn't look like search at all. It's collaborative filtering. So normally we get these search engine results that have been filtered and ranked in a way that's useful to us. But sometimes you don't need to do the search. This is what Netflix does when it suggests things to you. This process of suggesting stuff that you might be interested in doesn't feel like search, but the algorithms are very similar. They're trying to figure out what you want and ranking the information and kind of filtering it so that you have access to it. A lot of what happened behind a search box before is now happening kind of automatically and producing results that might be useful to you by creating a stream of those results without ever asking you what you're looking for specifically. Kind of affiliated with that is this increase in using deep learning and kind of machine learning to figure out what results are most important and maybe even what results are most important for you personally. There's a whole bunch we could say about deep learning. It's being applied to a really wide range of things, but we've gone from humans trying to figure out how you extract features, how you figure out what's important on a page and how you can balance that out to get results, to this happening very much automatically based on how people like the results that they get and a bunch of other factors. The machine learns to sort these usefully. And at least up until now, it can't really explain to you why it's given you these results. It doesn't think about that. It doesn't have the meta piece. It just says, I know that this is right. You'll have to trust my experience, that I know that these are the things you want. And that's kind of where we're going. It's not surprising. At one point, and this is now 15 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that, the VP of research at Google said, what our goal is to know what you are looking for before you do. That's just an incredible statement, right? Which is Google wants to know what you're searching for before you know you are. So if that's the ultimate goal, then these technologies really are moving us toward that. And it means that search will become far less visible, but at the same time, far more important. That is, we won't see it anymore,